Hey guys, Adam here with AmericanMuscle.com. Today we're taking a closer look at and installing the Roush lowering springs for all 05 to 14 Mustangs. You should be taking a look at the Roush lowering springs if you're looking to go with a very mild lowered ride height, coming in at about a ½ inch all the way around compared to your factory ride. This will stiffen up your ride, giving you that lowered center of gravity, giving you a better handling performance going around tight corners for a nice sporty feel. Now this progressive rate is going to compare to your linear rate, which we'll talk about a little later on the table sitting next to your factory spring. Now that $250 price tag, in my personal opinion, is a very affordable tag considering it is a very mild drop in ride height, but it will give you a different performance you can feel. The installation for a set of lowering springs, regardless of which ones you go with from the category, are going to get that soft 3 out of 3 wrenches on our difficulty meter here. Now there's no cutting, drilling, or any modifications necessary, but it does require the use of a spring compressor, which can be pretty dangerous if you don't have that mechanical expertise. Now you want to have a pole jack if you're using a lift like we are, or a hydraulic floor jack if you're working on the floor in your garage or your driveway. Jack stands also come in handy because you are pulling off all 4 wheels. Now the rear assembly all gets done at the exact same time. You'll be simultaneously working on both sides. Then the front you'll do individually, and I'll walk you through the process step by step, even how to use the spring compressor. Now it'll take you about 3 hours if you're working in the driveway at home, maybe a little bit less if you have a lift like we do here. I want to show you again step by step, so let's just get to it. Tools required for this install will be a cordless impact or a ratchet, extension, 19mm wrench, 10mm deep socket, 13mm deep socket, 15mm deep socket, 18mm deep socket, 19mm deep socket, and a torque wrench, as well as a spring compressor. Before we can get to the install or even the uninstall, we have to pop all 4 of our wheels off. I've got my air tools here and my 21mm socket. Now if you're working on the ground, you might want to have your lug wrench or appropriate tools on deck. Make sure you're supported nicely on jack stands as well. Now to kick things off for the uninstallation of our factory springs on our 06 GT in the rear here, we have to disconnect our rear axle so that we can decompress those springs and pull them out. In order to do that, what we're going to do is put our car up in the air and support the rear axle with our pole jacks. We'll put 1 pole jack under each spring on both sides under the rear axle. Now if you're not working on a lift like we are, you might be working on the ground in your driveway, in which case a regular hydraulic floor jack will do the trick. You can stick that right under the differential or the pumpkin and just support that weight by jacking it up a little bit. Once we disconnect the bottom bolt of our shock and the brackets of our sway bar on both sides, we'll be able to slowly lower down our pole jacks holding up that rear axle in order to decompress those springs. Again, if you're not on the lift and you're working with a hydraulic floor jack, you'll just slowly lower that jack down to decompress the springs. Now that's something you want to be very cautious about, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. First things first, we're going to put this up in the air a little more, put those pole jacks under the rear axle, and start getting to work. The first thing we're going to do here is disconnect our sway bar from the bracket holding it to the chassis here. We've got our 19mm socket and wrench. We're going to put the gun on one side of the bolt and the wrench on the other. And just pull this out. Now we're going to have to repeat the same process for the opposite side. You want to make sure you're duplicating everything you're doing on each side, dropping the sway bar out of the way, and then we'll move over to the shock bolt. Can bend those brackets down and lower your sway bar. Now the reason we had to drop the sway bar out of the way, number 1, is because that is one of the factors holding up your rear axle, but also number 2, we want to do that first because it is blocking that bolt head. If the sway bar was back up in its original position, we wouldn't be able to back our lower shock bolt out. So now that we have that dropped down, we have access to that bolt. I've got my 15mm socket. We don't need a wrench holding the nut on the other side because it's got this locking tab. Now if this is torqued on here too tight, you could of course use WD-40 to help you out, or a breaker bar. That'll definitely knock that loose, and then you can grab your impact gun or your ratchet and get it off. With that bolt out of place, you can see the shock comes loose. We'll be able to repeat this for the other side and then start lowering down our pole jack, or if you're working on the ground, your hydraulic floor jack, and decompress our spring. Now we're repeating that for the other side. All right, at this point, you want to lower your jack down very slowly to decompress that spring. You don't want to go too fast because it's under a lot of pressure, so you want to be cautious about lowering this down. All right, now that our springs are fully decompressed, we might need a little help getting them out. So I've got my pry bar here. We're just going to gently pry it out of its seat and then pull the spring off of the axle. We'll do the same thing for both sides. Now, if it's not stuck for you, you might be able to wiggle it by hand, but given that they are factory springs, they've been on there for several years, a little over a decade actually, so they might be stuck. It tends to happen with OEM parts like that. You might need a little bit of help here. A pry bar definitely will do the trick. Just have a little patience. Now that we have the rears all the way uninstalled, before we start installing anything, we want to tackle the uninstallation for the front here. Now it'll start off the same way. We've got our pole jack here underneath of our front hub assembly supporting that weight. That way we'll be able to disconnect our sway bar end link from the strut, and then the 2 bolts at the bottom of the strut holding it to our spindle. Once that's taken care of, it'll release all of the weight, which is why we want that pole jack supporting the hub. We'll be able to go underneath the hood once we put the car on the ground and remove the 4 bolts holding it to the top of our strut tower, and then we'll get to work with our spring compressor. But first things first, let's support the weight with our pole jack and then move on to the sway bar end link. Next up here, we've got our 18mm deep socket. We're going to remove the nut here holding on our sway bar end link. All right, again with our 18mm socket, we're going to knock off the bolts holding our strut to the spindle. All right, now we're going to do the same thing for the bottom bolt. Since the bottom bolt is torqued on pretty tight, I'm going to use a breaker bar to help give us some leverage to break that loose, and then we'll switch back to our cordless impact. So I've got my 18mm socket on the breaker bar, so let's get that off. All right, the last one here is the brake line bracket. All right, same thing for the opposite side here before we lower it down and tackle the top of our strut tower. We got our 18mm socket. We're gonna take off the sway bar end link from the strut. We're gonna knock off the brake line bracket bolt, and then of course the 2 holding the strut to the spindle. All right, now we can lower our Mustang back down and remove the bolts holding it on from the top of the strut tower under the hood. All right, now that we have this down and we have the hood popped, what we're gonna do is remove all 4 bolts at the top of our strut tower to release that coilover. Now, we do have a strut tower brace on our GT here. If you don't have a strut tower brace, you don't have to worry about it, but either way, it's using the same exact bolts, so either way, those bolts are coming out. So I've got my 13mm socket. I'm gonna pop these 4 off. Keep in mind that once you get down to the last nut on the stud, the strut is going to fall out from the bottom. So we do have one hand underneath. You can hold onto the spring. Once you get that last nut out, just pull the strut out from under the wheel well. All right, so now that we have those 2 off, we can lift off our strut tower brace. All right, so we finally got our factory struts off of the front end of our 06 GT. We're back here at our spring compressor. Now, if you're working with a spring compressor at home or you take it to a shop, just make sure you're exercising extreme caution. This can be pretty dangerous. So what we're gonna do is we have this set up in our spring compressor rigged to the wall here. When you're doing this, make sure you're clamping down on the bottom coil and the top coil. Compress the spring as far down as you need to, remove that top hat, and then slowly decompress the spring all the way back up. Once we have our new spring in place, we'll be able to put the top hat back on and do the same thing for the other strut. So we finally got our factory springs off of our 2006 GT sitting on the table next to our Roush lowering springs. Now there really isn't a ton to talk about when it comes to lowering springs. The materials stay pretty consistent throughout the category, whether it's compared to factory or some of the aftermarket options. You're looking at high tensile silicon steel wire, but this one here has that progressive spring rate. Now progressive, as opposed to the linear spring rate from the factory or some of the other options in the category, progressive there is going to start at a low spring rate, give you a nice comfortable ride feel just cruising around under normal driving conditions, but the second you start pushing it to its limits, the spring rate starts to grow and it gives you a stiffer, more sporty feel to your suspension. That's what you can expect from a progressive spring like the Roush lowering springs. The linear spring, on the other hand, gives you a very consistent spring rate, something you can predict. A lot better for guys who are constantly tracking their car, who want that linear and consistent spring rate, whereas the progressive option is great for guys with weekend warriors, seeing the track occasionally, but also driving a daily driver or something on the road more often. This is something you'd want for a more comfortable feel on a normal day, but something that gives you that stiffer feeling when you're taking those tight corners or under hard launches. Now this one, on top of, those tech specs, you're looking at a blue powder coated finish, which does look a lot cooler than your factory ones, but I will say, since it is under your suspension, don't plan on seeing this very often. Now getting these on the car is basically going to be the same process in the reverse order. So we're going to pop our front springs here onto our factory strut, compress it in our spring compressor, then we're going to put on that top hat, repeat that for the same strut on the opposite side. The rear springs are pretty self-explanatory, no extra work needed, no spring compressor. It is going to seat right in our factory spot with the factory isolators. Now if your isolators are, mangled out of the factory spot, now you want to pick up some new ones. We are going to have to transfer over our isolator sleeve here from the factory spring over to the Roush option. All right, so we can tip our factory springs off to the side and peel off that sleeve. We're going to go to the bottom of our Roush spring and just install these in the same spot. Now, in order to make sure that your ride is sitting properly, you want to transfer over these sleeves, which just slide on just like they come off of the factory one. It's very simple to slide over. You want to make sure you're leaving a little bit of a gap for the end of that coil. Now, we're about ready to head back over to the spring compressor, sit this on our factory strut, cap it off with the top hat after we compress it, and then we'll start with the installation. Here, we're going to enter this into the arms. Make sure you've got that seated properly. Once we have these seated properly, we'll slide our factory strut through the center here, cap it off with the top hat. So it's time to install our new Roush lowering springs on the rear end of our 06 GT. Putting these in, it's pretty simple. You want to make sure that the cone shape is facing up, the smaller down to the larger portion. The end of the coil at the bottom here is going to be on the front side of the vehicle section facing the middle of the differential. So what we're going to do is slide this into place here. Rotate it so that this coil is at the front facing the inside of the vehicle. All right, now we can lift up the pole jacks on both sides to compress our springs. You want to make sure you're lining your shock up into its factory holes here on the axle when you're compressing that spring. Remember, the nut for your shock has this little tab here, so that will lock into place. You just want to tighten the bolt on just a couple of threads, then you can grab your socket and your impact gun or your ratchet and tighten that down. All right, once we're done the other one, we'll come back and torque this down with our torque wrench. Swing up our rear sway bar. Now you want to make sure you're putting those brackets back into the appropriate holes on both sides. You're gonna have to line them up on both sides before you can bolt it down, otherwise it won't line up. All right, so once you have that in place, you're gonna take your bolt head and spacer, put that through the outside, then a spacer and your nut on the inside. Put the bolt through the other side of the sway bar and then tighten them down. All right, now we can tighten them all down with our socket, and then go back to our shock bolt and our sway bar bolts with the torque wrench. All right, now remember for this, you need your 19mm wrench holding the nut on the back side while you work the socket on the bolt head. All right, so now that we have our torque wrench set at 85 foot-pounds for the bottom shock bolt, we can torque it down. All right, now we can torque down our sway bar brackets to 52 foot-pounds with our torque wrench. With our rear lowering springs in place, all we have to do now is lower down our pole jacks, move on to the front. So we got our Roush front springs on our front struts here, so it's about time we put it back in our suspension assembly. We're gonna pop it through the strut tower and put the 2 bolts up top here under the hood toward the outside of the vehicle, not the ones that would go on the strut tower brace, because we don't wanna put that on just yet. So we'll slide this in place, put those 2 nuts on top of the studs just to hold this strut up. There we go. All right, we're gonna do the same thing for the opposite side. You wanna line up your spindle with the bottom of your struts, the 2 open holes, and put your bolt head through to hold it in place. All right, now we can do the brake line bracket. Next up here is our sway bar end link. We're gonna swing this back up to our strut, pop that straight through that hole, thread the nut on just a little bit, grab your 18mm socket and tighten it down. All right, now we can repeat that same process for the other side and then go back and torque everything down. All right, now the brake line bracket bolt. All right, and we'll finish things up on the driver's side here with our sway bar end link. Now we're gonna swing this up, position that so it slides through the hole. You might have to drop it down a bit, and then cap it off with the nut. Now for the 2 spindle bolts for your strut, you wanna make sure you're setting your torque wrench to 148 foot-pounds and then torque them down. You want to go back and torque down your sway bar end links to 85 foot-pounds. Now before we can put our final 2 nuts on each side of our strut tower, we want to throw on our strut tower brace. So this is going to go right on over. We're going to feed the strut studs through the holes of the strut tower brace, lining them up on both sides. All right, now all we have to do is throw our wheels and tires back on and we're good to go. Well, that's gonna wrap up my review and install for the Roush lowering springs fitting all 05 to 14 Mustangs. You can pick up the Roush springs right here at AmericanMuscle.com.